Okay, forgive me if I'm a little bit too passionate in this video, but usually when I make tutorials like these, I first look up other examples for the video I'm about to make so that way I can get an idea for what knowledge is already easily accessible to everyone. But this time when I looked it up, I honestly was really surprised to see how different everyone else's tips were compared to what I had in mind. I'm personally extremely confident in my flicks. I think it's definitely one of my strengths, but I guess the way I visualize them isn't really the same as other people. And obviously, I may be biased, but I think the way I visualize them is much easier to understand than every tutorial that I've watched. So even if you're confident with your flicks, I bet you can still learn something from my perspective, but anyway, I'm done hyping myself up, so let's go ahead and get started with the tutorial. So I'm going to explain flicks by breaking it up into different concepts, starting from very simple, just explaining what a flick is, and eventually working our way up to how to perform more complex types of flicks like the 180 backflip power shot type stuff. If you don't already know and you couldn't tell by the clips that I've shown so far, a flick is basically where you have the ball on top of your car and you use your dodge in a particular direction to launch the ball away. It's pretty much equivalent to dribbling and then shooting in real soccer or football, except dribbling in Rocket League is 10 times harder because you have to constantly be making micro adjustments to keep the ball in your possession. It's incredibly complicated. And in Rocket League, obviously you've got to learn to walk before you can run, so you've got to learn to dribble before you can flick. But if you're struggling with dribbling and you still want to practice the mechanics of flicks, you can actually go into a private match with slow motion game speed and it'll make dribbling way easier for you. So if you still want to practice flicks but you don't have the mechanical skill to practice them yet, that's one way you can do it. Okay, the process. Let's go step by step here. So the ball actually needs to be on a specific spot on your car in order for it to actually work. So here in this frame on the left, this is definitely a point where you could flick if you wanted, but for this frame on the right, you definitely couldn't. They don't seem like they're that different, but it just shows you how precise you need to be with where the ball is on your car. The reason dribbling is so tied to flicks is because if you look at a pro player dribbling, it's incredibly controlled and the ball is staying on that sweet spot on their car the entire time. So if the opponent were to suddenly decide to push at any moment during the dribble, it would just be an easy flick right over their head. But then you head over to look at the lower ranked player and you see that it's all over the place and they can only flick at specific points during their dribble. They can't flick instantly on command if the opponent were to push because their dribbling control just isn't there yet. That's why it's super important that you are really confident in your dribbles in order to be confident with your flicks. As for the sweet spot on your car where you could flick at any point that we saw the pro doing really well with, a lot of people say it's right in front of the center of mass on your car, but I actually totally disagree with that because the sweet spot is rarely in the same place. It depends on what type of flick you're doing and how fast you and the ball are going, so it's not something I could just point out to you. It's more something that you just get a feel for as you do more flicks yourself and as you watch people do more flicks. The only way I can really help you tips-wise for the sweet spot is by telling you that if you're flicking it to the side, then the sweet spot is obviously closer to that side, and if you're dribbling slower, then the sweet spot is closer to the back, and if you're going faster, then it's closer to the front. I think that's pretty self-explanatory, but it's still important to keep that in mind. So now, assuming you can dribble perfectly and flick at any point, and I know that's a big assumption even for me, but just for the sake of example, assuming you can dribble perfectly, now you've got to learn how to perform the flick itself. To the untrained eye, and I know that makes it sound scientific, so I'm sorry, but it's kind of true, to the untrained eye, a flick looks simply like someone has it on their car and then they just do a flip and it launches the ball. It seems really simple, but it is so far from it. Chances are if you're watching this, you've probably done a successful flick before, whether it was in-game or in training, but you've also attempted a flick that didn't go as well. And you could be watching this video now because you still don't understand what the difference was between those two attempts, where you totally launched the ball and where you popped it up and didn't hit it at all. And yes, that does tie into the whole sweet spot thing, but it more closely has to do with the part of the flick that I, for some reason, hear almost no one talking about, and it's the main reason why I'm making this video. And it's crazy because it's definitely the most important part of the flick, but you rarely hear people say it. What I'm talking about is what I call the cradle. I don't know if anyone else calls it that, but that's just what I call it, because it literally is like you're cradling a baby. You've got to be delicate with it. If you're bouncing up and down, then it's going to go cry and run away from you, and then you're going to be crying because you messed up the flick. Like, if you've got a baby in your hands, are you just going to take it and then yeet it immediately? No, you're going to take it and then cradle it. And then yeet it. No. But seriously, your flicks are going to be crazy inconsistent if you don't do the cradle before you actually flip into it. The purpose of it is to make the ball stick to your car super easily, because that's really how you get your flicks consistent. You need that gap between the ball and your car to be almost nothing in order for your flick to work. Sometimes you get lucky and the gap is almost nothing even when you don't do the cradle, which explains those times where you do those flicks successfully. But most of the time, the cradle is completely necessary to have any sort of control with it. Now, what the cradle actually is mechanically is just leaning to wherever you're going to flick it. And I don't mean literally leaning in your chair, I mean tilting your car to the side where you plan to flick it. So if you're flicking forward, then you cradle forward. If you're flicking front left, then you cradle front left. Take a look at how little the front left part of my car is moving compared to everything else. That's exactly what you want because that means you're not going to be launching the ball in the air when you first jump. That's also why I suggest just tapping jump instead of holding it down. Most of you probably know this, but you actually go higher when you hold down jump as opposed to just tapping it. Some people suggest you hold down jump when you flick because it helps reduce the gap between the ball and your car, but I actually disagree because if you do the cradle, then that won't matter and it's actually better to not move your car as much. I'd only suggest holding down jump on flicks where you can't exactly cradle easily, so like a front flip or a back flip flick, for example, since you're not really air rolling on those. Okay, I'm really glad I got this information out there. Hopefully this clears things up with why your flicks might be inconsistent because like I said, I've barely seen anyone talk about this. But that's not it, there's still a whole lot more that goes into flicks, so let's go ahead and move on to speed. When thinking about how to generate power from your flicks, it's important to think about how they actually work. So flicks are possible because when you flip, your car is turning really fast and the ball is propelled at pretty much the same speed that your car is flipping at. It's rolling off your car. The more touches you get on it as you flip, the more powerful it usually is. A way I like to visualize it is if your car is one of these slingy toy things. I don't even know what these are called. I don't think anyone does, but I'm sure most of you have seen them before. Basically, it's a scoop with a wiffle ball and you can sling it out and launch it pretty far without much effort. You gotta think of your car as the same thing if you're going for power. The more touches you get on it as it rolls up your car, the more powerful it'll be. But there's more to it than that. The power of your flick depends not only on the way you hit the ball, but also the speed you're going relative to the ball. I think it's pretty clear that if both you and the ball are going fast, you'll be able to get more power than if you were both going really slow. However, not a lot of people know that if your car is going slightly faster than the ball by the time you flick it, you can get much more power. Here's a diagram of what I'm talking about. So if you have the ball out in front of your car, like just a little bit too far out in front of your car to get a good flick, but you speed up to drive under it and put it in that sweet spot and then flick, you'll get way more power than you would normally if the ball was just sitting in that sweet spot the whole time. Going back to the sling toy example, it's like imagine you're slinging the ball with this length of a scoop. It's decent, right? Now imagine adding a little bit more to the front and starting the ball over here. It would get way more power. It's like the same thing with your car. Instead of having the ball camping on that sweet spot and then just flicking, if you start from the front and then speed up to make the ball go into that sweet spot and then flick, you definitely get way more power. The best way of doing this I've found is to boost through your flick. So instead of just having it on your car and then cradling and then flicking, if you boost through it, there's a much smaller chance that the ball will pop off your hood and you'll get more power. There are plenty of different types of flicks, some of them more competitively viable than others of course, but regardless, you should still definitely have a few different types of flicks that you could go to in different situations. For example, my favorite flick is definitely the 45, short for the 45-degree flick. So if you put this in slow motion here, you can see that it's definitely different with the way I'm turning my car from a normal flick, but it still works the same because I'm doing the same thing as the cradle where I tilt to the side that I'm flicking to, but the difference comes with the direction that I'm turning my car. I'm instead turning the opposite way to make it so my nose is the part of the car that it finishes off of. The reason this gets so much power is the same reason the 180 backflip flick gets so much power. Your center of mass is toward the back of your car and the sweet spot usually falls just in front of it as we covered earlier. But if you turn around and you plan on backflipping instead, suddenly the sweet spot is now right here and as you can see it gives you much more room for the ball to roll off your car and therefore gives you more power. Also, when you flip, it's pretty clear that your nose is the part of the car that's moving the fastest, so clearly, if you finish the flick off with your nose, then it should generate the most power. That's why the 180 and 45 flicks give so much power compared to the normal ones. So knowing this, you can try turning your car in different ways to place it easier and give it more power and make it harder to read on defense, anything at all depending on what you're going for. I'm going to go ahead and name off all the fairly basic common flicks that would be competitively viable. If I leave one out that you really like, don't take it personally, I'm just going to list off some of the common ones here that I really like. So there's the front flick, pretty much as basic as it gets, no explanation necessary. There's the diagonal flick, also really basic, it's just like the front flick but it's slightly to the side. Then there's the back flick, which basically just pops it straight up in the air. This one can be useful if you're trying to pop it straight up or off the backboard for a teammate. There's also the side flick, This one is used best when you're trying to cut in on a dribble already, and it's just as simple as side flipping to the correct side. So you can see I'm on this curved path here, and then I just side flip and it pops straight up. This one is a really good example of moving the ball into your sweet spot instead of just letting it sit there. You can see at this point, if I were to flick here, it wouldn't really go anywhere, but if I'm in the process of sliding under it as I flick, so I wait for the ball to get in this sweet spot right here, and then I flick, you can see it gets way more power than if I were to just flick it when it was just camping on the sweet spot the whole time. It's the same concept as where I show the diagram of the sling toy thing, where you add a little bit to the front and you can get way more power. But anyway, there's also the 45-degree flick, which I just talked about. You can flick pretty soon on command and still generate a ton of power with this one. There's also a 90-degree flick, which is literally the same thing except you're turned 90 degrees instead of 45. You can get more power on this one, but it takes longer to turn your car 90 degrees than it does 45, so if you have to flick given short notice, then you'll probably want to use a different one. And of course, there's the 180, which is kind of the same thing. You don't want to use this on short notice, and it's kind of hard to cradle with this one, so all you can really do is tilt your car slightly back like this, so you don't just pop it straight up. There's also the Jazer flick, which is pretty new. It's basically you just pop the ball straight up and forward instantly, and it's a really fast recovery as well. I'm not going to go over exactly how you would do it mechanically because there are other tutorials out there that would just say the same thing I would. There's also the classy flick, which is usually done from a bounce dribble. It's kind of like a 180, except it's done way up in the air. And of course, there's the musty flick, which I found to be most useful in the air after you jump off the wall or a ceiling, because you can get some crazy power if you get the scoop right. So that is pretty much everything you'll need to know about flicks in Rocket League to get started, or even if you're already decent at them. I'm really glad I could make this video because I know there are so many people out there that struggle with getting flicks consistently, so this video should clear up any confusion with it. If you're still struggling with flicks, at that point you've just got to keep grinding and put in the practice because there's no better way to improve at them than actually doing them. Anyway, that's it for me. Hit subscribe so you don't miss future videos like this one. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you later.